remains very much a traditional society, and it's very patriarchal. And the head of the household is usually the adult male. And you had two uprisings, one led by kids and the other led by women. And there is a message in there. And the message, and I'll come and quote the kids now, is, father or husband, you are incapable of delivering to us or fulfilling the primary obligation of every head of household owes his family. You owe us a future. We have no future. We have been cut off from Palestine by a wall. We are treated by Israel in the best of circumstances as a barely tolerated minority with alienable rights, rights that hang by a thread, and you'll hear more about that in a moment from my colleagues. We are not part of Israel. We are not Israeli. We don't see ourselves as Israeli. Ramallah neglects us. The Arab world promises us money that never comes. We are on our own. We don't have a future. Any political activity in East Jerusalem more radical than a scout meeting is crushed, and we have crushed scout meetings. There's one event that has been seared into the consciousness of all of the Palestinians with whom I've spoken in the last year and a half. About 4 or 5 months ago, on one day, Israel demolished the homes of 2 terrorists who murdered Israelis in West Jerusalem and sealed a 3rd. No, I'm not being accurate. We demolished and sealed the homes of their families who were guilty of no crime. They were not complicit. They were not implicated. The terrorists were dead. That's collective punishment. But that's not first and foremost in the mind of my Palestinian friends, especially the kids. Part of this uprising was triggered in a horrendous, heinous murder of Muhammad Abu Khtair, 15 years old, abducted from the front of his father's store and burned by Jewish terrorists alive. He was burned alive. The terrorists have been apprehended. They've been convicted. They have not been sentenced yet. But every Palestinian of age is asking, when are you going to demolish the homes of the Jewish terrorists, of the Israeli terrorists? This is not a complaint about unfair treatment. It is rage. The sense among the Palestinian kids is, in the eyes of the people who control our lives, official Israel, Israeli blood is red and it's blood, and Palestinian blood is water. As a rule, I very much oppose superficial comparisons between the experiences of Palestinians under occupation and the African Americans in the United States. I don't think it does justice to either population or either cause. But in this case, this uprising is about Palestinian lives matter. And under Israeli occupation, Palestinian lives don't matter. Now, what has been the response of my society? I have to admit to you, I think that Israelis and Palestinians are both in the throes of similar psychological disorders, very different though. My Palestinian friends and colleagues are in clinical despair. We are 23 years after Oslo, and we are not 1 inch closer to the end of occupation. But in Israel, Israeli society is in clinical denial. We are sipping cappuccino on the edge of a volcano. Our friends and colleagues in Tel Aviv are barely aware that we're occupiers. We don't see it, we don't feel it. So you have 3 responses today in Israel to what's happening here. Netanyahu, official Israel, we will break their spirit. We will impose collective punishment until they stop. There was collective punishment in the past, but it was episodic. Today it is systemic. You have had periods where there were 20,000 people, 200,000 people under lockdown in East Jerusalem. Tiny things. Just last week, I heard that a week ago Friday, on Friday evening, the Shabibah were out in force tossing rocks at the Border Patrol. The next morning, everybody woke up in Atur and found that their cars had been given traffic tickets. That is the insufferable lightness of occupation that is making lives unlivable. The other response is the forces of moderation in Israel. Herzog will build a wall. One says, we will solve this by demolishing homes. Oh, it's a shame nobody thought of that. Oh, now Herzog comes along, we will now build a wall and deny access to 200,000 Palestinians. It's a shame nobody thought of that. What is Herzog saying? It's not that the problem is occupation. The problem is that Netanyahu is doing occupation poorly. I'll do it well. And I cannot spare my criticism from my friends in the progressive forces of Israel who says, this is all about discrimination. If you only will build more schools and sewage systems, the Palestinians will be placated. If my analysis is correct, this message of this uprising is, we will not be broken and we will not be bought, we will be engaged. This doesn't end in a military operation in Issawiya. It doesn't end in a wall. It doesn't end in a sewage system. It ends when occupation ends. And there is only one way of ending occupation. And the only way that occupation ends is a border. And nobody is telling that to the Israeli public. And for the last couple of years, nobody has been seriously engaging in that effort in the international community. Now, this is not taking place against a static backdrop. Today, there are three very clear threats to the very possibility of creating an occupation-ending border between Israelis and Palestinians. One, and Khalil pointed this out, settlements. I'm not talking mood. I've spent my adult life combating settlements in East Jerusalem, but I'm giving you very, very specific calculus. In 2007, Israel would have had to relocate 116,000 settlers in order to create a border that Khalil and Mr. Ambassador could live with. Today, that number is approaching 160,000. It is growing by 5,000 to 10,000 a year. We are either slightly before or at the tipping point, where no possible Israeli government will be able to relocate the number of settlers necessary to create a border which reasonable Israelis and reasonable Palestinians can live with. We're that close. Secondly, and this has already been alluded to this morning, in the past, the religious establishments of Jerusalem have known that Jerusalem has to speak in multiple voices. And when I talk about the traditional establishments, I'm talking about the Vatican, the Sharia courts, the chief rabbis, the historical Protestant church, not because they're liberal. They're not liberal. But they understand that when one group has hegemony in Jerusalem, it's hell for everybody else. That's not the Jerusalem we're seeing today. We are seeing the ascendancy of those who weaponize religion, weaponize faith, those who claim to exclusively possess the city. And there are Jews, Christians, and Muslims like that. In the Israeli sector, you have biblically driven settlers in Silwan and messianically driven temple mounters trying to pray and build the third temple. You have the ascendancy of the end of days Christian groups for whom Israel signifies the return of Christ, and it is an Armageddon playground for them. They welcome religious conflict. Sarah Palin can see Haram el-Sharif from her front porch in Alaska. And then you have some of the nastier parts of radical Islam who aspire to a religious conflict that is exclusionary for their own reasons. The pyromaniacs are in ascendancy in Jerusalem, and the forces of moderation have been marginalized. And what we are witnessing is the morphing of a political conflict that reasonable men and women can solve into an absolute conflict of religious absolutes. Milchemet Mitzvah, Holy War, Jihad, Second Coming, Armageddon, hopefully in that order, and then we can all go home because it will be too late. Finally, Sometimes Jerusalem, or living in Jerusalem, is like living in Los Angeles. You can feel the pressure on the tectonic plates where there are earthquakes build under your feet. We in Jerusalem are living in a state of acute disequilibrium. I hate myself for having used the phrase, the status quo is unsustainable for so long, because today it's really true. Unless there will be a major political push to address the core issues of occupation, there is going to be a catastrophic event. It could be a collapse of the PA. It could be violence between Israeli security forces and PA security forces. It could be a catastrophic event on the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif. It is not impossible that the kind of Israel-Palestine that President Obama will bequeath to his successor will look like the Iraq that President Obama inherited from President Bush. Broken, hemorrhaging, dysfunctional, and not fixable. We are not there yet, but we are not far. Just a few words. I know that I'm coming to the end of, I've probably gone beyond it, but you're very kind, about the political context. I've come from Washington, I've come from Paris, and what's the dilemma confronting the international community? I can be very blunt, I'm self-employed. Assumption number one is there will be no forward movement under Netanyahu, or as long as Netanyahu is prime minister. Any attempt to move forward to address the real issues not only will not elicit cooperation, it will probably elicit sophisticated sabotage. Netanyahu is not sitting idly by, and Khalil showed this very clearly, that Netanyahu is willfully creating a one-state reality very systematically that will make the two-state solution impossible in short order. So the conclusion is, walk away, Mr. President, there's only grief in this. But there's another part of this dilemma, and that is the consequences of losing the two-state solution is a perpetually hemorrhaging conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. The implications for that, for Israelis and Palestinians, I'll tell you in a second. But regionally and globally, this is enormously dangerous to the world and regional order. Addressing Israel-Palestine is not the magic bullet that will cure the ills of the Middle East. But a perpetually hemorrhaging, violent Israel-Palestine will make all of the other conflicts in the Middle East much more difficult. So you can't get anything done. You can't walk away. Okay, smart guy, what do you suggest? Don't envy the people who have to make the decisions on what to do next. Very cautiously, I would like to suggest that there is a reasonable chance, 51%, that by the end of the second term of the Obama administration, there will be a serious effort to move things forward. It will not be a permanent status agreement, nobody's thinking that. But to establish with greater clarity, with greater unanimity, a wall-to-wall international consensus with a boilerplate benchmark Security Council resolution that will articulate what the two-state solution is. We'll replace the antiquated resolutions 242 and 338, and will say that anybody who undermines the principles embodied in these parameters will be held accountable by the international community, because they are undermining the regional and global order. One last word. There are two of us Israelis here. We're here with a number of Palestinian friends and colleagues, and I'm not saying that euphemistically. We're really good friends. I'm their occupier, okay? There's no making a distinction about that. I'm an Israeli, and we can go out and have dinner together, but I'm your occupier. But I'm also a victim of Israeli occupation. I'm an Israeli patriot. I'm here as a friend of the Palestinians, and I don't say that without any embarrassment or with any hesitation. But I am also here as an Israeli. I fear for the future of my country and for the future of my unborn grandchildren. There is no greater threat to the Jewish people than perpetuating occupation. No greater threat. Israel cannot survive as a perpetually occupying power. So by liberating my Palestinian friends from the burdens of my occupation, I am liberating myself and my children's future. But as they say in Yiddish, the shtetl is on fire. This is not a drill. And unless there will be serious international involvement in the months to come, we will be losing the very possibility of any significant agreement in the foreseeable future. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Sidman for the richness of information that he has eloquently and passionately presented. I would like to express the committee's sincere appreciation for your participation in this meeting. Next, I would like to introduce to you Ms. Bronagh Higgins, who is the International Component Coordinator with the Norwegian Refugee Council Palestine. She has previously worked with the International Bar Association, the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and with a number of local and international NGOs in Palestine for the last 3.5 years, including Badil Resource Center for Palestine and Refugee Rights and Al-Haq. In Palestine, Ms. Higgins has also conducted extensive research into issues relating to business and human rights, housing, land and property rights, and processes of population displacement. It is a pleasure and honor to have you, Madam. You have the floor.
Thank you. My name is Bronagh Higgins, and I'm here today on behalf of the Norwegian Refugee Council Palestine and its beneficiaries. NRC is a humanitarian organisation mandated to assist refugees and internally displaced people worldwide. And in Palestine, we work to support displaced persons who are affected by or are at risk of displacement in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. NRC is extremely concerned with the alarming rates and escalations of displacement throughout the occupied territories. As of July last year, IDMC, or the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, estimated that there were at least 263,000 IDPs, or internally displaced persons, in the occupied Palestine. However, since that figure was estimated last year, we've witnessed an extremely alarming rate and drastic escalation in processes generating displacement in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And before I go into that, I just want to say as well that the UN has recently estimated that there are still 75,000 displaced persons in the Gaza Strip as a result of the 2014 hostilities. UN OCHA has tracked the displacement of an additional 864 Palestinians this year alone in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and a further 2,465 persons adversely affected. And these are people that are only displaced as a result of home demolitions, evictions, and settler violence, whereas there are a much wider array of triggers of displacement in Palestine. Of that figure, the UN has tracked that 183 Palestinians have been displaced in East Jerusalem, again as a result of demolitions, evictions, and settler violence. This number has already overtaken the total figure for 2015, and we are only in May. The trajectory is extremely depressing. Again, as I mentioned, this just tracks displacement as a result of demolitions, evictions, and settler violence. But particularly in East Jerusalem, such displacement's not alone occasioned by these processes, but as a result of the combined effect of various numbers of push factors that are put in place to establish a coercive environment which leave Palestinians with little or no genuine choice to remain in their own homes. And such policies include the implementation of a discriminatory planning, zoning and permit regime, wanton destruction and confiscation of civilian property, forced evictions, restrictions on family unifications, obstruction of humanitarian assistance, land expropriation and absentee property law, settlement expansion, takeovers, settler violence, the construction of the wall, restrictions on movement and access, including access to basic services, and revocation of residency rights. Now, in the very short time that we've been allotted to talk on these topics, obviously you can see that all of these processes are much too varied and much too extensive to go into detail at the minute, so I've opted to talk about residency revocation rights in East Jerusalem. The reason being that there are taking place at the minute extremely worrying trends and bills being brought forward before the Knesset which would solidify extremely unlawful acts in the revocation of Palestinian residency rights. So just to give a bit of a brief background, it should be mentioned from the outset that it's Israel's explicit and stated aim to retain an Israeli Jewish demographic majority in Jerusalem and to minimise the Palestinian presence there. And this has been outlined explicitly in the Jerusalem Outline Plan 2000, where the Jerusalem municipality outlined certain measures and suggestions to be taken in order to retain a 70% Israeli to 30% Palestinian presence. This has since been suggested that perhaps if this is not attainable, that a 60-40% ratio would suffice. But let me just let that sink in, the absurdity of that, Jerusalem municipality has outlined measures to be taken to retain a 70% Israeli to a 30% Palestinian presence, and the complete discriminatory nature of such an aim. So as you all know, in 1967, Israel occupied the Palestinian territories, including the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and furthermore, unilaterally and unlawfully annexed East Jerusalem and began implementing its own domestic laws over the territory, again in violation of international law, thereby solidifying annexation. It furthermore, in 1967, conducted a census of those Palestinians who were residing in East Jerusalem and granted identity cards to those who were physically present at the time. And physically present meant that residents of East Jerusalem that were not there at the time of the census, be they visiting relatives elsewhere, were therefore not granted their residency. Under the entry into Israel law, these Palestinians were thus granted a status referred to as permanent residency. And this is a status which is typically granted to immigrants and bestows significantly inferior entitlements and protections on the holder than that of citizenship status, which is that status granted to Israelis. While there are certain similarities between permanent residency status and citizenship, such as the eligibility to work in Israel or certain social benefits, under domestic Israeli law, there's significant differences between both statuses, that of permanent residency or citizenship. And to that extent, holders of permanent residency are granted a laissez-faire travel document, but no passport. They are granted rights to vote only in local elections, but not Knesset elections. They are not granted the right of return, very importantly, which is granted to holders of citizenship. The status is not automatically transferable to spouses or children. It will be revoked after 7 years abroad, and furthermore, it may be revoked if the status of permanent resident or citizenship is obtained from what Israel refers to as a foreign country. And this classification of foreign country under these purposes also encompasses Gaza and the West Bank. Interestingly, however, Israeli settlers who live in the West Bank may retain citizenship despite the fact that, as per Israel's definition, they are now residing in a foreign country. permanent residency imposes a status upon Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem, as I mentioned, which is identical to that granted to immigrants, immigrants being those who voluntarily acquired such a status. And this completely disregards the special situation of East Jerusalemites who were present on the territory prior to annexation, prior to the unlawful annexation of their territory. And it imposes legal restrictions upon them which can't be disregarded in order to ensure that their residency status is not lost and in order for them to remain in their own homes. And this in itself infringes upon numerous provisions of international human rights law, including the right to retain a nationality, not to be deprived arbitrarily of a nationality, as well as the right of any person to leave any country, including their own, and to return to their country. And again, what we see are that Israeli settlers residing in East Jerusalem again may retain citizenship, and again in violation of the right to freedom from discrimination. So thus, permanent residency status is not fixed, it's easily revoked, and puts the holders of this status at a constant risk of displacement. As such, permanent residency essentially amounts to an inferior and insecure status bestowed upon one group of people, despite and as a result of an unlawful annexation of the territory on which they were already present, with the result that they are treated as immigrants and second-class citizens in their own home. I should outline at this point that Palestinian permanent residences are theoretically permitted if they desire and meet certain conditions